joining in. But we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here. This is several of our Charger Chat virtual series, so welcome. I'm Jennifer Brost. I'm a development officer at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, and I'm so glad you're here. I've gone ahead and muted everybody's microphones, but if people want to turn their cameras off also, that might be helpful. We are recording this call for anybody who couldn't join us this afternoon, or depending on your time zone this morning. We will be recording this. So you don't, if you don't want to make a cameo in today's Charger Chat, you may want to also turn off your camera. So I want to introduce UAH alumna Laura Ortman. Laura is the President and Chief Revenue Officer at Cologix. She leads the strategic sales and revenue planning and focuses the company on deepening customer relationships and broadening the go-to-market strategy to include a fast-growing ecosystem of hyperscale cloud providers. She's responsible for all aspects of how her company interacts with both current and prospective customers. She has over 23 years of experience, and she attended UAH from 1993 to 1997 and graduated from UAH in the College of Business. And while she was at UAH, she played tennis for the UAH Chargers. So just to let you know, I'll have Laura speak first, and we'll allow some time at the end for question and answers. And if you have a question, you can use the chat function to submit your questions to me, and I'll go ahead after Laura's finished and ask those questions to her. So Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry that we had to reschedule. I'm glad all is well with your family, but for now, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can you hear me okay now? Perfect. Excellent. Okay, so thank you for this opportunity to meet with all of you. As Jennifer said, I work for Cologix, and just to tell you a little bit about Cologix, we are a network interconnection ecosystem company where we have 30 prime interconnection hubs. So if you think about data centers that support the hyperscalers or the cloud service providers to provide interconnection and support across the globe. We're in 10 markets across North America, and I've been with the company 2 years. And just to tell you a little bit about myself personally, as Jennifer said, I went to UAH right after I graduated in 1997. My husband and I, fiance at the time, moved to Denver, Colorado, where we've lived here now for 23 years. And we live here with our twin daughters that are 17 years old. So they are starting their senior year in high school actually next week. And we have a golden retriever that's 4 years old as well. So very excited to speak with you around leading teams remotely. And what I thought I would do is just, talk about the evolution, but also talk about what it's meant for me and our company, as well as best practices that we've leveraged. So, working remotely essentially has evolved over the last, 30, 40 years. And I don't know, this was kind of a fun fact that I thought I would share it. Actually, the very first person to ever work officially remotely was through the NASA communication in 1973. And then, in the 70s, IBM did an experiment, had 5 of their employees that tried working remotely. And I would say it's evolved, before this pandemic, working remotely was about 43 to 50%. You had some companies and startups that really supported it, other companies that I would say did more of a hybrid approach, and other companies that really weren't that comfortable in working remotely. They felt like, that in-person in-office communication was key. And now, through this pandemic, the percentages, I would say outside of the roles that have to be, on site, for example, for us, we have data center technicians that can't do their roles remotely, that we provide the PPEs and support, and safety for them to be in the data centers. But outside of that, 90% of our company is now working remotely. And we really, we haven't seen any impact from a productivity standpoint. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we've seen. So we've definitely evolved, and I would say that evolution has accelerated over the last 4 to 5 months due to the pandemic. And I think there's some key takeaways from that as well. So wanted to talk about what has stayed the same and what has changed. So really before we've moved into, really a lot of companies working remotely 90% and more of their staff, we did have leaders and managers who had remote teams. Prior to Cologix, I worked for a global organization, and really that was the majority of my career in the last 20 years. I had global teams. So I had teams in APJ, in EMEA, in South America. And so I had to have the ability to not only lead teams in office where I was located, but also remotely. So that really didn't change for those managers that had that experience. We still are doing conference calls, still managers are having one-on-ones with their employees. Companies are still doing all hands where you'll have some remote staff and some in person. A lot of companies still have remote working sites, and essentially all companies and organizations and universities, they're all driving results. And it's really trying to find that balance of work life. I do believe it makes it a little bit harder now, and I'll talk a little bit about my experience, but that balance has always been a focus of organizations, over the last, 30, 40 years. What has changed is, until now, remote working has been slower to adopt. So you'll see a lot of companies. I think Twitter was one that announced that they're going to full remote workforce. That are really moving towards more of a remote workforce. More employees are really learning to use remote technologies. And I think the biggest change is the lack of in-person engagement. So whether you're walking down the hall to see your teammate or your employee, having lunch with your team, in-person meetings, and this affects us from a customer standpoint, meeting with our partners and employees, traveling to meet. I spent a lot of time the last 2 years before this pandemic to go in market in our location to spend time with our employees that I haven't had the opportunity to have them come to our corporate office. In-person interviews, all our interviews are done now remotely, and essentially having the challenge of maintaining visibility across the organization. And I'll talk a little bit about what we've done. So there's been really this shift in, driving motivational strategies as well as employee engagement, through this remote working. And I would say employers need to be more flexible, as well as executives and leaders, and all of us as leaders and managers need to embrace remote working models. Because even as we go through this pandemic and after, you'll see that shift and change of having that remote working. So I'm going to start sharing a little bit of some of the best practices and things that we've learned as a company, I've learned as an individual leader and executive. And I think number one, the key piece is taking care of you as a leader, right? So if you're taking care of yourself, you're taking care of your employees. And I think the number one thing is you've got to lead by example. And when I talk about leading by example, we talk a lot about, employees need to take breaks throughout the day. What we found was you're stuck on, you're doing a lot more video calls, Zoom meetings. You're at your desk a lot longer. You're not taking breaks. You don't have the commute. And so leading by example in that sense, making it okay for your employees to do the same thing, take breaks, the necessary breaks, spending time with their family, not working, all hours of the day, I think is important. Identify the best times to meet with your employees. I think prior when we were all in the office, you obviously have kind of the work schedule, but now with people dealing with daycare, with personal situations, I really came to find out to check with my employees to see what works best for them. And it may be early morning, maybe later, maybe middle day, but really engaging with your employees to see what works best, especially when you're doing one-on-ones. I talked about taking breaks. I'm a big fan of, taking a walk during lunch, and I'll talk about some of the activities that we're doing to share that as part of our employee engagement. Making time to unwind, taking deep breaths and doing activities that you can enjoy. And so we did this fitness bingo. You'll find that we've done a lot of fun activities and employee engagement where we'll do a bingo for a week of how many people can do this, throughout their day. And it's just even taking 10 minutes out of the day to get some exercise or to eat healthy. The second piece was really having resources that you can provide to your employees. So we started a weekly wellness newsletter where we've got our the head of talent that essentially and recruiting that have taken this on, but she works with all the employees to share best practice around what's worked for them. So this is just an example that we've done around, spending times outdoors, things that you can do to support yourself, key links and best practices that other organizations are doing. And, one of the things that we found was, the things that you can do for your coworkers, recognition is big. When you meet with your employees and you ask them what motivates them, they may tell you, money, career advancement, but also recognition. And so we leverage a platform called Gusto, where we can recognize our employees and how they exhibit our core values. And that is accessible to all of our employees. And then during our bi-weekly all hands, we recognize them through that tool. Also, really spend a lot of time reaching out to our employees that maybe you haven't spoken to in a while. Obviously, you're close with your team, but there may be, supporting organizations and key stakeholders that you haven't spoken to. We found that, just picking up the phone and just checking in with them and see how they're doing. Everybody is dealing with this in their own way. And it's been important to have that key contact. So I set a goal for myself every week to at least reach out to 5 to 10 employees that I haven't talked to in a few weeks. And then what we've also done is we've created these connect calls where any employees in our organization can join this video call. We don't talk about anything from a business standpoint. It's all around what's happening in, your city. We've got a large team in Montreal. So, talking about what's happening there, what's happening, within their lives, some of the fun things that they're doing, or some things that they're struggling with. And we've had employees that have lost loved ones the last, several months. And this has been a really good forum for them to just, get on a call and just have that level of support. So those have been really successful for us. And then we try really hard to provide, working remote tips, how to set up their home office, and people manager resources for those managers that haven't managed remote workers, and things that we can do, from a physical well-being and sharing best practices, and also some best recipes. So that's been a big topic for our employees, as a lot of folks aren't going out to eat as much. And so sharing recipes with each other has been key. So this is all around employee engagement, but also supporting our employees, as they're working remotely. This is just another, example of, our newsletters that we've sent, some tips. You'll see a lot of this that we do both English and French, because we have such a large presence in Montreal and Canada that we do everything in English and French. And so we provide resources and tips throughout. And I would say if you've got a global, organization, then you would really want to tailor it toward their local language as well. So when I was thinking about, what are some of the best practices for me, as a leader and manager, and I would say there's really 6 key things that I think about. One is communication and over communicating as you have, remote workers, whether that's, making sure that you schedule one-on-ones, but also meet with your employees one-on-ones. I very rarely cancel one-on-ones unless there's an absolute, critical customer meeting that I have to do, or an emergency. I mean, these are really important for our employees and for me to touch base with my team. Touch base calls I talked about, and then just giving feedback, providing more often feedback, because employees always want the feedback. And so again, over communication. We like to have fun. So I started theme calls for my team calls. So I meet with my team every other week, and I'll show you some pictures. We've done an 80s theme call. Our next one is Saturday Night Live. That is next week, where everybody comes dressed up and we vote on the winner, and whoever wins gets to pick the next theme. And that has been more fun than I ever thought it would be. And, if we weren't having, so many people working remotely, I'm not sure I would have thought of that, but that's been a lot of fun. We also are doing a wellness challenge And we're using Strava. I don't know how many of you have used Strava, where you can post when you go for walks or when you go for a run, or when you're on your Peloton. I got a Peloton in December, so I'm a Peloton addict, and really just sharing how we're driving wellness across our lives. So we've got competitions with that, as well as we're doing scavenger hunt tournaments, which at first I wasn't sure how those were going to go. And I'd like to say that my team is in the final four, and we're competing next week, where we provide a list of items that each team has to get in 5 minutes and come back. It's a video call, and you work with your team, whether they're, in the same city or not. And the folks with the most items that they received on the list, they went and go to the final round. So if you think about March Madness, it's kind of like a March Madness, but it's more of a scavenger hunt. So that's been a lot of fun. And we have a lot of competitive people within our organization, me included. So that's just been a fun thing to do. So I think our team's done a great job in identifying ways that we can just mix it up a little bit with, the level of stress and that's going on in people's lives right now. I think the other piece around, having remote workers is clear vision and expectation. So establishing a culture of ownership and accountability, but also leading by example and making sure everybody is going down, the right path and working towards the same goals. And so over communicating those is key as well. Encourage your teams to leverage. We have an employee assistant program. If there's any type of assistance program that your organization has, I think that's really important to reiterate that. And supporting your teams at home workspace. We've got a budget where we're giving everyone, all of our employees, up to $100 a month to make sure that they're, whether it's the internet bandwidth, it's their office, desks, we've got a lot of employees that like to stand up and work, as they're standing up. And so really supporting that is important. And then there's the human element of, again, employee highlights and recognition. So what we've started is, we call it CoLogix Weekly Warriors, where every week we highlight an employee and we ask them 4 to 5 questions around what's the best vacation, what makes them smile, if they could have dinner with a person, who would it be and why? And it's been really a great way to get to know our employees and for everyone to get to know each other as well without being able to be in an office together. And then I would say the last thing was just continuing to build, strong relationship with your employees and continue the recognition and awards. So this is just an example of, you'll see that we had a best wig on your left. On your top right, we've got 80s, which, by the way, I won that one. And then you'll see the Top Gun by my sales leader there in the middle. And then we had a Western theme. And we even had some of my leaders made their own costumes. So that was a lot of fun. So, you're hearing a theme about employee engagement and what's really worked, for us as an organization. I thought I would share just some key questions that managers can ask, that you can ask your employees. You don't have to ask it all at once, but as you're meeting with them or you're connecting with them, it's really good to kind of understand what's going on with them personally and also from a business standpoint. And so these are some of the key questions that I've leveraged over the last 5 to 6 months, and even prior, as I had remote teams from a global perspective last 20 years. And again, employees, it's important for employees to know that their managers care about them and want to know more about them than just, what they've gotten done this week, right? From a priorities and action perspective. So that's all I have. So I couldn't do this presentation without saying go Chargers. And, it's been really an honor and a privilege to speak with all of you. And I will open it up for questions and answers. And hopefully this was helpful for everyone. And Jennifer, I'll stop there.
That was great. Thanks, Laura. Please go ahead and type any questions you have into the chat. I did have one question that came up. Besides video conferencing, how do you keep in touch with your staff on a daily basis, or how do you recommend that managers keep in touch besides video conferencing?
So we use a lot of tools. So I would say email is good, but I sometimes I find that email is used too much and people aren't picking up the phone. So I like to call my employees. So I would say if it's not video, it's a phone call. We also use, there's a lot of chat, tools out there. That's a great way to just touch base with employees and for them to touch base with you. We use the Zoom chat as well as RingCentral chat. And then if you're using Microsoft Teams, all of the tools, the video tools have a chat mechanism. So that's always great. And, if I'm available, I'm on the chat. If I'm not available, I get off the chat. And so it's really a great way for employees to touch base with you, especially on quick things that you want to do. And then, we'll do some live calls, but that's video as well. So I would say chat, email, phone call, and video, especially right now, until you can see them in person.
Great, thank you. We do have another question about productivity. You mentioned that you've seen some changes in productivity. Can you be a little bit more specific about that? And then there's some follow-up questions too.
Sure. And, I think this goes aligned with clear vision and expectations, right? So if you've got a clear vision and expectations for your employees, productivity can be measured in a lot of different ways. So for example, in my area of responsibility in driving revenue growth for the company, I've got a sales team. And sales team, they've got a quota and you either meet that quota or you don't, right? So that from a productivity standpoint, you can see, and there's a lot of other things that we measure around sales demand generation and pipeline and all of those things. From a customer experience, we've got certain metrics that we can drive from productivity. I think our productivity has increased. I think there's a balance to that though, where I talk about that work-life balance, where I do feel like, there's been a lot more impact on people's stress level and just working too many hours. And we actually, what I didn't mention is we provided what we called a day of rest in May, where we had everybody take the day off just because, it's been tough on everyone and we felt like we needed kind of a break. So I think from a productivity standpoint, even when you were in the office or if you're working remotely, there's a level of accountability and measurements that you can do. And then there's some subjectivity to that even before. And there's a level of empowerment that you empower your team that as long as they're driving results, you're empowering them to deliver on what they say they're going to deliver. So we talk about our objectives on a quarterly basis. And so we talk about, what from a productivity, what has worked well, what hasn't. Now, if you have an organization that the productivity has decreased, then certainly depending on the type of organization, you would go through the same process as you would if you had them in the office. So I wouldn't change that approach.
And another portion of that question was, have some departments handled remote work differently? Are there any that excelled specifically or any that struggled more than others?
Yeah, I would say there's the majority have been very consistent in how we've been leading our teams remotely. I would say, obviously, from an operation standpoint, we do have about 30% of our staff that has to be in the data centers. And so certainly there's some differences there. I think the team that's probably struggled the most are the customer facing teams. For example, sales is so used to being out in front of customers, whether they're, traveling, whether they're, golfing with their customers or having lunch. I think that's probably been the biggest challenge. Now, I would say that customers' availability has increased because they're not traveling. And even our sales team's availability has increased because there's no travel time. But I think people are struggling that building relationships and face-to-face interaction. Even though we're doing video, that's fine. But it's all about relationships, especially from a sales perspective. So I would say that's been our biggest struggle.
Great, thank you. I think you've answered those questions perfectly. I think we have time for one more question, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it. What's the most difficult thing to evaluate in terms of personal interaction when you're in online meetings?
Well, I think there's there's a level of engagement that you see on video versus, conference calls. And I would highly encourage you to make sure that people are on video. I think before this all started in the last 5 months, you would have video calls, but the majority wouldn't actually be on video. And I think now it's really important to have that just from an engagement perspective. And, you can see people's faces and you can see them smiling. And I think the other aspect would be have fun with it. It's long days, a lot of video. I mean, this is probably my 5th video call today, right? Making it fun, taking breaks throughout that process, that's been a huge contributor for us, in checking in on the team. But I think making sure that they're, on video, you can see them. And as you're checking in with your employees, you'll see how they're doing, and how they're working through this. And yeah.
Okay, final question. Have you changed your approach to communication?
I would say I've changed my approach. I would say that I've changed the level of the cadence in which I communicate. So I've always, I think I learned early on in my career as a leader to communicate and to engage with the employees and to spend time with the employees. So that's always been, one of my kind of top focus areas as a leader. But I would say that I do it a lot more often now, checking in with our employees. And so I would say the cadence has increased. A great example is we used to do quarterly all hands. We do them now every other week. And our employees, we do employee surveys once a quarter just to see, how's the level of cadence, how are things doing with people working remotely. We've been checking in on them. And the biggest, most positive feedback has been on our communication and cadence of communication. And that's been really important to our employees. And so now we do the all hands every other week. So I think from my standpoint, communication has always been key. And if it has not been a focus area for you as a leader, I would say it really needs to be, especially now. And really it's just the increase of cadence, Jennifer, that I would say.
Well, great. Well, that takes us all the way to 1 o'clock. We try to start and end on time. So Laura, thank you so much for joining us. I think this was great information. I hope everybody can go back to their virtual offices, or maybe you're already back in your office and you can actually put some of Laura's tips to action. So thanks, Laura, for being with us today. We so appreciate it.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for the opportunity. And please don't hesitate to reach out at any time.
Great. Our pleasure. Thank you again.
Bye. Bye, David.
Take care.